What's up, creatives? We're here, as always, and I thought I'd share with you one of my recent projects that I've been working on. This is a design system where I'm working with React to create some UI components, and I'm using StyleX, the new meta kind of like styling paradigm that they created that basically creates atomic CSS styles for the CSS that you make in your app, basically. It's kind of like Tailwind, but it's not. It uses a lot of the stuff from post CSS, but it's not. It's kind of like the new CSS and JS on the block. So I thought I'd dig my hands into it a little bit and see what it's like. And part of that process for me, always adding responsive utility props to the design system. So basically what you always see in like all the different component libraries where you have like width equals 100 pixels or something, like you could just pick like any value you want and just plug it in there. Color equals blue, like that's always nice. But I actually really like it too when you can do width equals 100 pixels on mobile, 150 pixels on desktop, 500 pixels on a widescreen. And you can kind of like set those responsive dimensions on a component level through the props. So that's what we're going to be looking into today a little bit using StyleX. And we'll see just the kind of hoops that you have to jump through to get to that. So let's dive right in because YouTube does not give me a lot of time. So to give you an idea of what we're going to be working on here, I have Storybook open. This is the design system a little bit with a few of the different components and stuff. I have some basic theming set up. So we have a light mode, we have a dark mode. I'm mostly working dark mode for the homies. And like I said, it's going to be an exploration of these style props. So as you can see, I have a lot of these different kind of like stories kind of developed already for all the various different style props we kind of support. Margins, padding, the width, the height, responsive props. So stuff like that. So to kind of give you an idea of like what we're working with here, let's actually pick the container component because it's actually like colored and stuff. But you can see here that we have a component that's like, say, I don't know, it's like 500 pixels wide or something. Here's the container component. It's about 800 pixels right now. You can see 800 pixels. It's a little small, but yeah. And then if I come up here, we can resize the viewport inside of Storybook, and I'm going to make it basically a mobile screen. So now that it's a mobile screen, if we come back in here and I inspect it and I come back to that container, we'll see that it's actually 320 pixels. Much smaller. Should be like 400 actually. But you get the idea. It maxes out to like the size of the container. I think another good example is this one. You can see here that we have a width of 1080. And this is on kind of like my desktop viewport. And you can see here that we have variables for all the different breakpoints. We'll get into this later. And I have a kind of like regular one. I have a small viewport, and then it goes all the way up to like an extra large kind of breakpoint. So this one's currently on the extra large breakpoint because obviously we are on an extra large breakpoint. So if I were to take this and actually make it a, let's say, tablet size, which makes it, I think, 800 pixels wide or something there. I think that's what it's telling me. Yep. So if we go and we look at the box again, now it's the small container size because now the viewport is actually about a little greater than 700, about 800 pixels or something. So we get that viewport, and with that one we get the small breakpoint size, which is 420 natch. So you can see here that as the window changes size, we're getting different breakpoints, we're getting different CSS values for each breakpoint. So how does this work? That's the magic. We'll get into that. I'm over at the code. We're looking at the box component, which is the same component that we've been looking at. It's this kind of like a div for like everything. This is the base component that a lot of different design systems use. So we're here in the box component, and I have like box props, as you can see. And with the box props, we have all the different, style props that we support. The width, the height, top, left, everything that you would kind of want to quickly set using the React like properties. We have them here. We have a custom responsive style prop, custom prop that I created that basically lets you know that it can be basically a object that kind of delineates all the different breakpoints, which is a record in TypeScript words. But you can see here that it's basically just an object, default, small, medium, kind of like how we were seeing earlier with the values in our CSS variables. Or we can basically pass the value itself. So instead of passing a responsive prop, we can just pass the prop, and that also works as well. But let's go down to the actual logic of the component. You can see that we do a lot of importing of the props themselves, and then we pass them basically into this function here called handle responsive props. And this function basically goes and grabs all the props that we pass in, and it takes a mapping of basically like, we say like, what are these variables that we want to pass? Like we're passing a width, we're passing, flex, all this stuff. Do any of those have to actually deal with design tokens? And do we want to map those particular values to design tokens? And in the case of like width and height and padding, we do. We actually want them to kind of map to our spacing tokens inside of our design system, so that if I write like a 0 or a 1 or a 2, it automatically knows, oh, he wants the 1 design token, which is like 5 pixels or something, and it creates that kind of connection. And then here we pass in the actual styles from StyleX, and I'll get into that later, but that's basically kind of like a Tailwind type setup where we have all of our breakpoints preset and pre-compiled, and we basically pick and choose which styles we need from the pre-compiled styles. So let's take a look at that function. If I look inside of the handle responsive props, it's like I said, we take the props themselves, we take a mapping, and we take some StyleX props, which are basically just an object of like CSS classes, and then the value is actually the class itself, but you get the idea. But basically this function just loops through the various different props that you provide it, and since it's an object, it uses the for of or for in loop to basically just loop over all those different props that we passed. If it's an undefined prop, we just skip it, obviously. And then there's a lot of different like magic here. So we have like shorthand that we have to handle. So if a person passes like an MX, we have to know that that MX actually is a margin left and a margin right. So we have a little bit of a shorthand kind of like mapping up here that takes multiple styles and lets us know, is the MX, what is it? And it's made up of these two styles, not just one style. So that creates that kind of system for us. And then once we figure out what style we're even using, we can pass it in. This is the system basically that I was mentioning, where if we come over here, you can see I basically created a TypeScript script, say that 3 times fast, that goes through and it takes all the different utility props that I need in my system, and it generates these styles for us. So I can show you that function here. It's basically a simple function. It takes an array of like props, and it generates a lot of different like basically the text that you're seeing here. And basically it generates it because, as you can see, it's a lot of repetitiveness. And what we're doing here is we're saying for each of these properties, we need a style generated, kind of like a variant. And this style associates itself with each CSS prop. So I have one for width, height, whatever. And then each one is associated with its own CSS prop. So this is the width CSS class, and then it targets the width CSS prop. Looks a little confusing there, but once you know StyleX, you'll understand. And then StyleX lets you basically define breakpoints inside of your styles here. So I can basically say I have a default breakpoint that just everything falls back to, and then I can define other breakpoints that I want here. And I can I have them defined as like constants, so I can reuse them across all the different styles that we have there. As you can see, it gets very repetitive. And basically the way that this system works, this is kind of like the magic here. I basically set a variable for each breakpoint. So basically what the handle responsive props function is doing is it's going and taking the props that you give it and it's saying, hey, I'm going to take all these props and I need to figure out, one, if you have any design tokens for them. And if you do, I'm going to grab the design token and make the CSS class and do all that stuff. And then once I have that, I'm also going to grab you the CSS class that is associated with that prop so that you can actually have it styled and usable or whatever through the breakpoints. And when it does that, it actually goes and it'll actually set a variable for each breakpoint. So I have a variable, let's say how I was doing for the default viewport. Let's see over here. So you can see here, this is one of the tests for the box. I have the PX prop here, and it's a responsive prop, so I can pass it an object of the different breakpoints and some like token values that I want for each of the different breakpoints. So basically what I'm doing here is saying the PX should be default, like when it's default, it should be 1, and when the viewport is large, it should be 3. And what the handle responsive props function is doing under the hood is it's creating a CSS variable that's basically px dash default and px dash large and associating these values with that so that we have those associated with our DOM element. It's in there. And then we have these styles that reference those CSS variables that we create and then taps into that. So by having this kind of like CSS class available to us, you can see here, if I inspect, it basically falls back and uses whatever I need. So you can see I set the width, small, width, medium, width, large. But since we're on the small viewport, it only uses the small CSS variable. And the beauty of this system is that it cascades kind of gracefully through all the different breakpoints. And that's why you see so much CSS here in a way, leveraging the fallback system of CSS variables where I'm able to define a CSS variable and then define a fallback. So by doing that, I'm able to say, hey, if I have the width variable, use that. If not, do whatever, right? But we take that a step further by saying, hey, if you got the width small variable, use that. But if not, fall back to the original width. And then that goes all the way up to the extra large where we'd use the extra large one, and if we're not using that one, we're using the large, and it'll just keep stepping down until it finds the right one that it needs. And that allows us to basically do stuff where I can set a default prop and then an extra large one, and then the ones in between, they know how to gracefully fall back to the default one. Because basically if we didn't have these kind of fallbacks and we only fell back to like say the default, the styles would kind of get thrown off. You know, your responsive layout would be kind of like jumpy. It would go from like big to small to really small to like big again to small. You know, this kind of makes it go as gracefully as possible. We basically use a function here to grab the CSS variable for the prop. So if we put in like a width 3, it should translate to using the space CSS variable, which is in my case oat milk. Oat dash space dash 3. And then, like I said, we generate breakpoints if we need to, or if it's not responsive, we just pass the prop just as needed. So ultimately, all that we're returning is CSS classes, which are basically just what I showed you, like this, and we pick and choose which one we want. And then we're also generating inline styles, which are basically all the different CSS variables that we need to power those kind of responsive styles. You can see that I have the responsive classes here. We have responsive width and responsive width again or something, you know, like I have it a few times. And then we have all the CSS variables that I apply as inline styles, which you can see as like the style equals element here. But cool. Appreciate you guys watching. Like I said, I could talk responsive style props and design systems all day. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, make sure to let me know in the comments. Drop a like, subscribe, all that stuff. And yeah, I'll be producing more content like this, hopefully without a 15-minute restriction. That really limits the amount that I can speak on these subjects. But if you're interested in seeing more of this stuff, let me know. Hit me up on socials. And if you're interested in seeing this design system, go over to Oat Milk Design on my GitHub, and you can basically check out the source code. But yeah, as always, stay creative.